This weekend I have a few tasks that I need to get done in the kitchen, including some preserving. I have a few preserving tasks I'd like to get done before garden season really begins, so I started out by just pulling some chicken bones out of the freezer. One of the things that I'd like to get done over the next few weeks is making and canning a ton of broth just to clear out some of the bones from butchering last summer. We have our first batch of meat birds arriving mid-April along with the pigs, so I want to get these freezers to a good spot so I don't have to be running the canner more than I have to when I'm busy in the garden and it is hot out. Now, for most of my broth, I leave it very plain. I don't roast the bones or add any aromatics to it. I'll leave it very, very simple, and that makes it really versatile, and I can season it depending on what application I'd like to use the broth in. But I have lots of that plain broth on the shelf in the canning room already, so I am making a more flavorful broth today. Starting out by roasting the bones, so I set the oven to 400 and I put all those bones into my stainless steel roasting pan, and I'm going to let those roast for probably about 45 minutes or so until golden. While those were roasting, I got to feeding my gluten-free sourdough starter. This is a brown rice flour based starter, and later in the video I have a gluten-free sourdough boule that I want to make, so I got my starter fed so that it would be ready to go when I need it. Now, this time of year, our chickens are finally starting to pick up on laying, which I appreciate, but it is also the time of year where their run is very muddy and the eggs are a bit of a mess. So while unwashed chicken eggs will last at least a few weeks on the counter, as long as the bloom is intact, when they're dirty like this, I really do need to take the time to wash them up right away, and then they'll just be stored in the fridge. For my broth, I really like to use this stainless steel roasting pan since I can roast the bones directly in it and then just transfer it over to the stovetop to simmer. For this batch of broth, I added a few carrots as well as an onion, and I also added in some celery leaves. We preserved quite a bit of our celery from the garden last year. It was either frozen or dehydrated, and I don't want to be using that for broth, so dehydrated celery leaves makes a perfect addition to broth that's going to add a lot of flavor without using up some of the celery that I'd rather save for soups and whatnot. I also added in a package of chicken feet that we saved from butchering last year, and I know if you're not familiar with making broth with chicken feet, this might sound a little bit intimidating or weird, but it is going to make for a really gelatinous broth. I topped off my roasting pan with lots of filtered water, brought that up to a boil, and then I covered it and left it to simmer overnight until I was ready to can it the next day. It is the next morning and I am ready to get started with my gluten-free sourdough. This recipe is from a creator named Kelci. Her brand is Heritage Home And Hearth, and she is a magician when it comes to gluten-free baking and gluten-free sourdough. She has a couple ebooks filled with incredible gluten-free recipes, one that uses an all-purpose gluten-free dough for several recipes, and then she has also just recently come out with a recipe for a gluten-free sourdough boule, and I can tell you that this bread turns out so incredible. It has become a staple in our home. If you need to eat gluten-free and you have been at all disappointed with gluten-free recipes, particularly bread, you must check her out. I'll leave a link to her sourdough boule resource down below. With that, she shares a PDF recipe along with a video tutorial, which is super helpful. For the bread, I added my gluten-free sourdough starter along with a variety of flours and starches to my stand mixer and got that mixing on low speed. Now, with gluten-free baking, you need to add something that is going to give the dough that stretch like the gluten would provide. So in this recipe, psyllium husk is going to provide that. I whisked together the psyllium husk and some water really well until it had gelled up, and then I added that into my stand mixer with the rest of the ingredients. Pie dough, crackers, bread, etc. I really like to use a pastry board. This is a marble pastry board, and since we do have butcher block counters, this just helps to keep them clean because flour can be a little bit hard to get off. I liberally dusted that with some millet flour and then turned out my dough. You'll see that this looks very different from your typical gluten-containing bread dough. In fact, I used the paddle attachment, not a dough hook, which you're able to do in a recipe like this. I kneaded this for just a couple minutes and then shaped the dough. I liberally covered the dough with some more millet flour before transferring it into a bowl to rest. Covered that and I set it aside for just a few hours until it's ready to bake. While I was waiting on the bread, I got going on my broth. So this had been simmering overnight and it's looking nice and golden brown. So I strained off the broth and then I put that pot back onto the stovetop to heat and I prepared my jars. My jars are clean and hot. I'm canning in quart jars today. That is typically the amount that I'll use in one go. I'm filling my jars to an inch of headspace. Once I have all of my jars filled, I cleaned the rims off really well with some white vinegar. That's my preference anytime I'm canning something that's either going to be sticky or potentially greasy, just to make sure that we get a good seal. I applied clean new lids and rings to fingertip tight and I prepped my pressure canner. I'm using a Presto 23 quart, so I added the appropriate amount of water and then added my jars. For quarts, the broth is going to process for 25 minutes. Another task that I had on my to-do list was dealing with some of the smaller potatoes that we have left from the garden that have started to sprout, so I went ahead and pulled up some of those so I could get them cleaned and washed, and I wanted to get those prepped and into the freezer before they were too far gone. I got my oven preheating for my gluten-free sourdough, and while I was waiting for that to preheat, I got started on cleaning up these potatoes. For my bread, I got my cast iron Dutch oven lined with some parchment paper, and then I turned the dough over, placed that into the cast iron Dutch oven, and scored the bread, covered it, and it was ready to bake. Now back to the potatoes. Before I freeze them, I'm going to blanch them for just a couple minutes. So I got a pot of water boiling, and I'm going to be freezing these potatoes cubed. I am not someone that loves kitchen gadgets. I really don't like a lot of clutter in my kitchen, but this chopper is super convenient and it really does save some time, and it's perfect for an application like this. Since these potatoes were pretty small, a lot of them I just put into the chopper hole. I transferred the potatoes to the boiling water for about 2 minutes, and then I strained those off and rinsed them really well with some cool water to stop the cooking process. At this point, my canner had come down from pressure, so I cracked the lid for a few minutes, then removed it and allowed the jars to sit in the canner for about 10 minutes or so before removing them. That just helps to prevent any siphoning with a more gradual change in temperature. This bread turned out so good. I wish I had gotten a clip of slicing into it, but I wanted to let it fully cool before I did. And this has become a new staple in our household. So if you're looking for any great gluten-free recipes, you definitely need to check out Kelci's offerings. Again, I'll leave all of her information in the description box down below, or you can find her at Heritage Home and Hearth. The potatoes took a few batches, and at this point they had fully cooled. I had transferred them onto just a couple dish towels to absorb any extra moisture, and I transferred those onto a parchment-lined baking sheet in an even layer to freeze before I transferred them into a Ziploc. Now it is the next morning, and I am just cleaning up all of my jars of that beautiful broth to get them ready for the pantry shelf. I froze those potatoes overnight, so I transferred those into a Ziploc bag, kind of breaking them up a little bit since I had them in a little bit thicker of a layer than I typically would leave them in. So some of them are a little bit stuck together, but not as bad as they would have been if I had just thrown them all directly into a Ziploc bag. So those are going to be great to have on hand for quick meals. Now, another thing that I wanted to get done was make a batch of my breakfast sausage patties. I use our ground pork for this, just some maple syrup, and some basic seasonings. I love making these, and I make them quite regularly, but I find it's worthwhile for me to do a larger batch and put some in the freezer so we have them ready to go whenever we need them. Typically I do these in a cast iron skillet, but I decided to do these in the oven today. I'm using 2 pounds of ground pork. I added that into a large bowl along with some maple syrup, some pepper, some salt, ground sage and a little bit of garlic powder, and then I just got that all mixed together and formed that into some patties. Another great addition to these is blueberries. I had planned on adding some today, but we ran out. So simple it is. You can really do whatever size you prefer, and I just placed these onto the parchment lined baking sheet and bake at 425 for about 15 minutes or so, and I typically like to flip those halfway. As always, I'll leave the full recipe in the description box down below. Now, I had a little bit of that sausage left over that didn't fit onto the baking sheet, so I decided to use that in a frittata that I was making. Frittatas are a go-to for us. It's something that I prep often for some easy breakfasts during the week, and they're just super easy to make and a great way to use up some eggs. So I got my cast iron skillet heating over medium-low. I added in a little bit of lard that I had rendered. I shared that process in last week's video. And then I just added in that leftover sausage, let that start to cook up a little bit. This cast iron skillet is for sure my most used pan in the kitchen. I use this thing at least a couple times a day. I also had some chopped red onion in the fridge that I needed to use up, so I went ahead and added that in when the sausage was almost done cooking so that it could saute a little bit. And then I cracked 6 eggs into a bowl, added a little splash of milk, some salt and pepper, whisked that together really well. I pretty much always will add some sort of green when I'm making a frittata, so today I just crumbled in some dehydrated kale that I had from the garden. A little bit goes a long way. If you've ever dehydrated kale, you know it shrinks down quite a bit. So I sprinkled a little bit of that onto the sausage and onions and then topped that off with the whisked eggs. The eggs will begin to cook as soon as you pour them into the cast iron skillet, obviously. And then I went ahead and transferred that into a 400-degree oven for about 5 to 8 minutes, just until it's set. You don't want to overcook it. We were also out of homemade mayonnaise, so it was time to restock on that. If you have not made homemade mayonnaise before, it is beyond simple. You just need a few ingredients, some oil. You can really use whatever oil you like. My preference is avocado oil. It is very neutral in flavor. So to a wide mouth pint jar, I added about a cup of avocado oil. I was actually running a little bit low on this today, so I did a little bit less than that, and it still turns out great. Then I do a little bit of apple cider vinegar, a little bit of lemon juice, some Dijon mustard, and a whole egg. I really don't measure anything at this point because I do it so often, but if you do want a full recipe, as always, I'll have that in the description box down below as well. Super easy to make and much better ingredients than some of the store-bought options. The trick to homemade mayonnaise that turns out every time is to use an immersion blender. Just place the immersion blender right at the bottom of the jar. Don't move it for probably the first 30 seconds or so, and then I'll start to tip the immersion blender just a little bit to allow some of that oil from the top to come down and mix into the mayonnaise. And this is ready in about a minute. That wraps up today's video, a peek into some of the preserving tasks that I had going on in the kitchen this weekend, as well as a little bit of from scratch cooking and meal prep. Thank you guys for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.